All right, let's talk about this. By the way, put your questions and comments into the chat. We will have some Q&A time today. For now, I want to talk about low-intensity conflict. This is something we talked about yesterday. Just as a reminder, there's a professor over at King's College at London who sounded almost certain that there will be a civil war that occurs in a Western country. So we're talking predominantly in Western Europe, so countries like the UK or Ireland or France or over here maybe the United States. And it was very good. Basically, he said, kind of a baseline, there are a number of countries that exhibit certain factors, risk factors, and countries that exhibit those risk factors have about a 4% annualized chance of civil war breaking out, so quite low. But you extend that over 5 years and you get this compounded rate of about 18.5%. But then when you take these 15 countries that all have these risk factors, the chance that any of these countries experiences a civil war in the next 5 years is something closer to 90 or 95%, somewhere in that ballpark, which is almost certain over the next 5 years by 2030. So yesterday I covered some thinking on that. Today I want to talk about how this country moves from its current low intensity conflict, which is ongoing, how that could potentially turn into a civil war, which is something we're talking about much higher death tolls, we're talking about far greater disruption and a lot of national level instability. It's not impossible. I don't think it's very likely in the near term, but there are a handful of scenarios that concern me, especially from 2028 to 2030. So yesterday I outlined the current odds of civil war, quite low, but there are some conditions under which a violent conflict becomes far more likely here in this country. And we are already in a period of low intensity conflict, and I'll go back over what that is here in just a second. So the questions from my perspective that are left is number one, how does this turn into a full-blown civil war? And two, how likely is this to actually happen? Now, I think the United States actually recently avoided, or at least possibly only delayed, the most likely cause of a domestic conflict in this country with the election of Donald Trump in November 2024. And the reasoning is, had Kamala Harris won, we would have almost certainly seen a continuation of Biden's mass immigration and open border policies. That would likely have been coupled with a push for amnesty or some other pathway to citizenship for easily 20 million illegal aliens. And that number may be far higher. It's definitely not lower. The Center for Immigration Studies and the Federation for American Immigration Reform, both of which are conservative institutions, estimated the number of illegals at 14.8 million and 18.6 million, respectively, at the beginning of 2025. You know, we've heard about, there's been 10 million illegals in this country for 20 or 30 years. Smart people should not buy that. So these are two, I think, conservative estimates of what we're really looking at. But the unsettling truth is that no one actually knows exactly how many illegals are in this country, and it could obviously be far higher than that. So to put this into context, in Texas in 2024, there were conservatively an estimated 1.7 million illegal aliens, and that is slightly more than Trump's 1.5 million voter margin of victory in the state. Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, other states, solidly red states and purple states, have a similar pattern. They have more illegal, or had more illegal aliens than Trump had margin of victory. So in other words, it would have been a matter of time before a pathway to citizenship, much less mass amnesty, flipped these states against Republicans, given what we know about voting and demographic patterns. And the consequences of this would have been relatively swift and likely irreversible change in the balance of dominant political and cultural power. Disenfranchisement at the highest levels. And I bring this up because one of the few very good points in her book, How Civil Wars Start, former CIA analyst Barbara Walter points out that in many cases, civil wars begin when groups of people who previously had power, especially dominant political and cultural power, lose it to another group of people. And rather than give up that dominance, they are far more likely to engage in political violence to take it back. And I think that is a fair point. And that is exactly that is the scenario we would have been looking at in the years to come had Kamala Harris won the election. Now, speaking personally, and I suspect tens of millions or more of Americans feel this way as well, I struggle to envision a scenario where conservative Americans, especially large numbers of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, just quietly accept this loss of not only our representation in government, but also our political and cultural and economic futures through the debasement of citizenship and the voting electorate. This would not have been about losing a single election. It would have been about an indefinite period of irreversible and really illegitimate single party rule, even if it was done quote unquote legally. So I look at this scenario and say, well, would this have happened, or would this have led to a civil war? So at a minimum, I think we would have seen some level of probably regionally popular secession movements. That's historically enough to generate political violence. I'm not sure that it would rise to the level of civil war necessarily, but it could. But regardless of the likelihood of actual secession, I'm not actually sure that it could pass some of these states in a referendum. But what else beyond that is unpredictable, but it would not have been peaceful and it would not have been stable for the country. And so luckily, I do think we escaped this scenario, or again, maybe just delayed it because it could still happen. And frankly, there are some other scenarios that concern me. So to remind you, let's just talk about these fault lines, accelerators, and conflicts. Fault lines, accelerators, and triggers of conflict. Whenever we talk about especially low intensity conflict, we're looking at these three factors. And last year, when I told you that the far left would not riot and there would not be a civil war if Trump won the election, and when I told you that the far left was not going to riot during the inauguration, it's because I was looking at these three factors. And we start with fault lines. They can be racial or ethnic, class-based, economic-based, religious, political, ideological, so on and so forth. The BLM stuff back in 2020, that was race-based, just as an example. So these are the tectonic plates that shift. Okay, this is actually what causes the tremors and eventually earthquakes. And then we have accelerators of conflict. And if you think about a pot of water that you put on the stove, right? It takes a while to boil. And it doesn't boil unless you turn that burner up. And so accelerators of conflict are things like opposition media and propaganda, how they cover certain things and the way in which they cover certain events, like especially through omission of key facts and just extremely biased perspectives in the reporting. Certain acts of violence can be accelerators of conflict, certain government policies that inflame the situation, demographic shifts, elections, political tribalism or racial tribalism, etc. These are all accelerators of conflict. And one of the things that I did not see late last year was acceleration of violence on the far left. And that was one of the big things why I just said, this pot is not hot enough to boil over for the election. This pot is not hot enough to boil over for the inauguration. I still think the left is, I see a lot of disintegration on the left, and they're not even hitting 2017 levels of unrest. You got to hit 2017 levels of unrest before you can hit 2020 levels of unrest. That's another reason why since last year I've been saying 2020 is not going to happen again this year, and I still don't think it will. At any rate, once you start to see bubbles boiling in this pot and you get to a low boil, now you're ready for a trigger event because there's enough pressure and the social temperature is hot enough to actually start boiling over and explode. And at that point, you're just waiting on a trigger event. And so there's been lots of trigger events. George Floyd in 2020 was obviously the trigger event for that, for the Summer of Love. But even that was only after 4 to 5 years of just constant agitation and provocation and acceleration of conflict. And we just have not had that in this country for the past 4 to 5 years. Certainly not that level that we saw from really 2015 into 2020. So the question is, we have this ongoing low intensity conflict here, and how do we move from that into a full-blown civil war? Is that even likely? So just to remind everyone, I use 4 criteria to say if a conflict is a civil war or not. It's got to meet these four criteria. Number 1, the government has to be a belligerent. So two groups in a country going to war is not going to be considered a civil war, not unless they're fighting against the government. Number 2 is the deployment of the military beyond a police action. So deploying the National Guard is not enough to say something is a civil war. You're talking about deployment and engagement of a regular army component or regular military component. The third thing is effective and sustained combat by both sides. So a genocide would not be a civil war. These people actually have to fight back. And number 4, a minimum threshold of combat-related deaths. And usually that's 1,000 or more in a calendar year. And I think this is kind of the most tenuous position because it seems kind of 1,000 deaths just seems kind of arbitrary. I mean, like you're going to have 900 combat-related deaths. It's not a civil war because it's not 1,000. Okay. But the underlying principle here is that a civil war produces a large death toll over a sustained period of time, regardless of the exact number. By the way, for those who ask, I take these criteria from a book called Resort to Arms, International and Civil Wars, 1816 to 1980 by Small and Singer. It's a fantastic reference book. At any rate, all other conflicts that do not meet these 4 criteria are referred to as low-intensity conflict. And this includes everything from violent social movements. So the BLM violence that we saw in 2020 is obviously not a civil war, but it was a low-intensity conflict. So that includes violent social movements, terrorism, guerrilla conflicts, nonviolent popular revolutions and color revolutions, all the way up to insurgency and counterinsurgency. All that stuff is low-intensity conflict. So, and this is a legitimate domestic conflict. I've been tracking it professionally every day since 2016. It's been my main job. So this form of domestic conflict remains my baseline expectation for at least the rest of this decade and probably well into the 2030s. So with that, there are at least 4 scenarios that could drive an acute low-intensity conflict, which could turn into a civil war. And in general, these are not the only 4. I just think these are the probably 4 most plausible. So number 1, a failed presidential election. That's obviously on the top of everyone's mind every 4 years. But in this scenario, you'd have 2 presidential candidates with diametrically opposing visions. So it is pretty intolerable for the other side to accept a defeat here due to their politics and ideology. And so you have these 2 presidential candidates that declare victory despite credible fraud, or at least a perception of credible fraud, or some otherwise illegitimate outcome. So a Supreme Court ruling. And again, it is intolerable for the other side. They do not tolerate it, will not tolerate it. And maybe in this scenario, a large number of states refuse to certify the election, and then the military gets deployed under the Insurrection Act to arrest these state officials, resulting in armed political violence. And I know we're putting our prepper doomsday fiction hat on here, but I'm just kind of laying out how this scenario could happen. Regardless of its likelihood, this is a scenario. Another thing that concerns me greatly is a dirty civil war scenario. And we saw this happen in Argentina. Well, I didn't see it happen personally, but it ran from 1976 to about 83. And in this case, you would have a federal government that conducts a violent campaign against dissenters and political opponents. So we're not just talking about debanking of people by their politics. We're talking about state-sponsored terrorism, arrests. One of the big things in Argentina, and actually a lot of other places throughout Latin America, are basically death squads, state-sponsored and non-state-sponsored terrorism, state-sanctioned terror, essentially. And so this is where the state would not prosecute kind of paramilitary violence that's conducted on its behalf. And this is exactly what happened in Argentina. I'm fairly concerned that something like this could obviously happen here and just spiral out of control and eventually lead to at least 1,000 combat-related deaths in a calendar year. Another thing, again, regardless of likelihood, is some form of secession movement, regardless of the cause, but you would have this group of states pursue secession or some sort of autonomy from the federal government. I look at Kurdistan as a really good example of a regional autonomous government. I think in a long enough timeline in the United States, I think that is definitely a scenario that could happen. And then that would result in federal occupation of those states, which could obviously spiral into a large death toll. I think a Feds out movement is also has reasonable likelihood over the next 5-10 years, easy. And that would be a campaign, and maybe eventually a violent campaign against federal law enforcement or federal assets at the county or state level. We're seeing something like this at a very low level, but something very not too dissimilar, like in Los Angeles and Portland. Very low level, but I could see that also spiraling out of control potentially. But at any rate, this Feds out movement would happen probably at the county or state level. And in some cases, some of these groups would cite the 10th Amendment, sovereignty, and states' rights to resist what they say would be unconstitutional federal overreach. And then finally here is some form of economic collapse. And I know that's a big boogeyman. And collapse is one of those terms that I don't use very often because it's extremely vague. And I think people should say exactly what they mean. But just in this scenario, what I would be looking at is a U.S. sovereign debt crisis, which I do think will happen. And the dollar's loss of world reserve status, which again is almost certain to happen over a long enough timeline. May not be imminent, but it will happen eventually. And those things can easily trigger a cascade of political, social, and economic failures. And again, we're talking about accelerators of conflict. How do you turn the temperature up on a country? And having a currency crisis is one really good way to do that. So I think this scenario, honestly, is the most likely to trigger a civil war, because ultimately we will probably be talking about who gets to decide the country's future. And so I'm going to cover this in a little bit greater detail. I just got done reading like a couple weeks ago, Ray Dalio's latest book. It's called How Countries Go Broke. And it is about the coming U.S. debt crisis. And it's written by legendary hedge fund manager Ray Dalio. And it is about the likelihood of a catastrophic U.S. debt crisis in maybe the near future. He estimates at least an 80% chance of a debt crisis here in the United States in the next 10 years. And just due to the scale of the debt we have in this country, remember, it's not just $37 trillion in national debt. It is over $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And globally, this is not just a U.S. problem, this is a global problem. There's something like $750 trillion in the global derivatives market. How you create $750 trillion to be in a market like that, I don't know, but obviously not sustainable. One of the best things Ray Dalio says in this book, he says his biggest bets come from he will find something that is clearly unsustainable, and he says he will get in a position to bet that it will not be sustained. Okay, pretty good bet there. At any rate, his historical conclusion is that these debt crises most often end existing political orders. So we're talking about state breakdown. When a government has just gone catastrophically in debt, they lose legitimacy, and people don't want to support that government anymore. And he also writes that democracies, small d democracies, where the people vote, are often replaced with autocracies as a result. In fact, he writes, quote, "In times of disorder, power matters more than laws, and authoritarianism works better than weak, disorganized," and he's talking about democracies. He says weak, disorganized collectivism, but really he's talking about democracies. And he writes that the United States is pretty classically in the final stages of what he calls a debt-death spiral. And he says this is where countries are, quote, over-indebted, inefficiently run, divided, and threatened by other countries. So there's a strong tendency for leaders with populist, nationalistic, protectionist, militaristic, and autocratic approaches to emerge. And this is mostly because there are so many disaffected citizens in these countries who demand radical change to fix their systems and make them work well again. Okay, this is kind of like, I just want the trains to run on time type of moment for these countries. So I question if those demands will ultimately lead to a left-wing populist or a right-wing populist. But I think Ray Dalio is right here. We're going to get one or the other eventually due to the demands of the people on this debt crisis. And like I look at this Mamdani guy in New York City and how basically he's come in and said, look, I understand you have all these problems and I'm going to fix them. And people said, yeah, we want the problems to be fixed. And they don't care how they get fixed. They just want someone to hold their hand and promise to fix them and try to fix them. It's going to make things much worse, far worse in New York City if he is elected. But you question how Mamdani can win something like that. And just because people want someone to fix the system and they fall victim to these promises. And that's pretty much what we're looking at here in a left-wing populist eventually. At any rate, historically, Ray Dalio writes that these big debt crises lead to massive destruction of wealth. And we know this. And it happens through one of two ways. It happens through debt deflation, where money and wealth are destroyed because debt is destroyed. One person's debt is another person's asset. We're talking about massive asset destruction during a debt deflation, basically a massive default problem. So it happens through deflation, or it happens through inflation or hyperinflation of the currency, where money and wealth still get destroyed. So either way, we're looking at wealth evaporating, wealth that stays in this country that is not moved somewhere else or put into some other form. And these periods are extremely difficult for most citizens. Most citizens are going to be struggling to get by when this eventually happens. And I am assuming that this fiscal reckoning and debt crisis is unavoidable and inescapable at this point. You go back 5, 10, 20 years, maybe we could have avoided it. I don't think we're going to avoid it anymore. In terms of when it happens, I don't know. Just again, Ray Dalio says 80% chance over 10 years. That's if things don't get worse, precipitously worse from here. So I don't believe there's any, I've been saying this for several years now since I've been writing this weekly economic early warning report. There are no easy ways left. There are no easy options out of this. There's only painful solutions left. And so this is running in the background for any of those civil war scenarios that I covered. This is obviously going to be a factor. Economic, financial, monetary crises are going to be a big factor in the likelihood of a civil war or how it gets resolved. Just a quick thing on Dalio here. I started paying attention to him in 2016 because I was watching CNBC and they're at Davos at the World Economic Forum. And he hops up on this interview, never heard of this guy before. And he starts warning about a domestic conflict or civil war. And he says, broadly, this will be between capitalists and socialists. And this is something almost 10 years ago he was saying publicly. Again, Ray Dalio is a billionaire hedge fund manager. He has made billions of dollars by making good bets. And frankly, someone that I think we should at least listen to for perspective. So if Dalio is correct here, and I think he is, that periods of economic, financial, and monetary crisis do produce more extreme politics, then it stands to reason that the United States may actually have a violent conflict between capitalists and socialists over control of the levers of government. And that could come about in a number of ways. But I do see this as the most likely outcome, probably in the next 10 years. If I had to bet on anything, if we assume that amnesty, mass amnesty, and pathway to citizenship, maybe they're not over. But we have at least gotten over that hurdle. That we would obviously have seen that under Kamala Harris. But if that scenario is sidelined, I've got to say a debt crisis, this fiscal reckoning, a conflict broadly between capitalists and socialists, I think that is the most likely scenario where we will see a civil war. Now, how likely that is can be debated. But of all the possible scenarios, I do see that as the most likely. But bottom line here really is that low-intensity conflicts, especially things that we have seen over the past 20 years here domestically, violent social movements, domestic terrorism, 2020, I think, was an attempted popular revolution. We can look at Portland, Seattle, especially. I would call those proto-insurgencies. They're not classically an insurgency because they're not an armed attempt to overthrow a government. But I would say they exhibit characteristics of an insurgency, or an insurrection at least. I call them proto-insurgencies. So all this stuff remains my baseline expectation for the foreseeable future. If nothing else happens, we are going to be dealing with this form of domestic conflict. with enough accelerators of conflict, with worsening grievances that motivate participation. Remember, because we're talking about organized political violence here. So groups of people conducting coordinated, deliberate, armed violence. I think things have to get much worse before we see that. But there, depending on what the grievances are, we could see greater participation in this type of activity. And with the right trigger event, even a low intensity conflict can rapidly turn into what we would call a civil war. So that's my take on civil war. With that, let's go ahead and jump into some of these other